We're going to go right to the history of Christianity as we're continuing on. We've reviewed these. I don't know if we need to keep reviewing these, so I'm just going to skip through some of the church eras. Last week we talked about the Reformation Church, 1500 to 1700, and really Europe and that area of the world is pulling away from the stronghold of the Catholic Church and a lot of the false doctrine, a lot of just the really immoral behavior that the church at that time had taken over that part of the world. And the grip had been loosened by Martin Luther, Zwingli, and so many other reformers, Huss. And we see us move in now to what we're calling the Revival and Missionary Church, 1700 to 1900. And this is an interesting period of history because it really starts to affect us. A little bit of history, we said in the 1500s was the age of exploration. The New World began to be discovered, and really the four big countries that were settling in the New World were Spain, Portugal, France, and England. And so the Reformation era, during that age of exploration, pulled out of the Catholic Church, but there were still cold, dead churches. State churches were still a part. The Church of England separated. They became Protestant, but the Church of England just took the place of the Catholic Church. And so the state still ran the Church of England. Spain still stayed in Catholicism. France was in Catholicism. Luther pulled a lot of Germany out. But again, a lot of the Lutheran churches, a lot of these European churches were still very cold, very formal. People weren't born again. And this spiritual deadness kind of moved over Europe. Groups like the Pietists and Moravians in Europe sparked a new interest in missions. We'll talk a little bit more about them. Aaron Vance, when he spoke, was speaking of two Moravian missionaries. He was talking about two missionaries that went to the slaves and actually sold themselves into slavery. Those were Moravians, and they came out of these groups. We'll say a little bit more about them here in a second. But the settlers in the New World brought all their religious beliefs and practices with them. We are affected by what is... a lot of people say this: we are in the Western culture, Western Europe and the United States, Canada. We have a culture of Judeo-Christian values, and it's really because of these people that brought their religious beliefs and their practices over. And here this new nation is formed during this time, the United States, that is still this great experiment, and we'll see how long it lasts, but it is a baby country compared to all these others. But we have established our U.S. Constitution with the freedom of religion. And so different from the old world, the new world practices something different, but it didn't start off that way. The colonies, many of them were still persecuting each other and those that believed different. There was still religious persecution. There were still colony churches. I mentioned Roger Williams. I didn't put him in the slides just for sake of time. Roger Williams, just because he was a Baptist, we want to say something about him. He founded Rhode Island. He founded Providence, Rhode Island. He was kicked out of all the religious places around the colonies, and he had to go settle on himself. And he by himself, and he went to the natives, and he started winning Native Americans to Christ, and he established Providence and Rhode Island for years, and I guess it's still known as this, though it's not a lot of Baptists there anymore, the Little Baptist State. Roger Williams was a Baptist who wanted separation of church and state. And so we see this mixture of people coming over from England, Spain, Portugal, France. Portugal kind of fell off the scene. Spain was defeated by England in the 1500s at a great naval battle. And so Spain, their colonies, they still had some colonies, but who was going to be the big leader in the New World? It was between England and France. When England won the French and Indian War, that really put England at the forefront of establishing new colonies. And, of course, that becomes the 13 colonies. But they bring their religious practices. A lot of Puritans, a lot of separatists, a lot of people who had no interest in God at all. They just wanted adventure in the new world. But all of this sets the stage for what we have today, okay? One of the names in Europe during this age was Philip Spener. He was a German Lutheran. He saw this deadness and coldness in church. And he realized we're not even talking about the Bible as much as we should be in church. So he started his own in-home Bible studies. After church, he would have services and studies in his home. They would talk about the sermon. They would talk about Bible studies. And his opponents called them pietists. And again, like Anabaptists, it was kind of a derogatory name. You pietists, you think you're more pious than all of us. You do extra church. And they weren't trying to be Pharisaical. They just wanted to get more scripture into their daily life. And so he was persecuted, but Spener is known for the pietist movement in Germany and in Europe. Another guy in this time period was Nicholas von Zinzendorf. He was influenced by Spener as well. He was associated with Moravians, who we've talked about a little bit. Moravians had a massive influence with the mission, and Nicholas von Zinzendorf did as well, had a massive influence in missions. And as we look at this age, we're talking about the revival age. This is an exciting period of history because missions are being sent. England takes the forefront with the American colonies, with the British East India Company, and England's empire spreads. And with the English empire spreading is a lot of English missionaries. Before America was really even established, England was the great light of the world, sending missions all over the world. And part of it was the English empire. Part of it was the influence of Europe. And these folks in there, and their concern and care for others, foreigners, even the pilgrims, even those that settled in the New World, many of them wanted to come and evangelize people in the New World. Not all of them, not every conqueror, every discoverer wanted to do that. Some of them, they were converted by the sword. They put a gun to your head, and you're now a Catholic. I'm now a Catholic. I'm here. But overall, the Moravians, Lutheran, Pietists, even the Anabaptists, von Zinzendorf was not so particular on the structures of denominations. He just kind of saw everybody as children of God, so he was a little looser on that. But the people that wanted separation of church and state, the people that believed very similarly out of these groups came to him. There was persecution among some of these groups, and he started inviting people to his estate, and he established a little community of a bunch of Christians. Out of that community of Moravians, Pietists, and Anabaptists, they began sending missionaries. And so he was a huge leader in missions in the church area. So that's Europe. Again, there's so many names in these. We're just skipping through. We fast forward back over to, skip over the Atlantic Ocean, come back over. And America, before the Constitution, before our founding fathers and all of that, we go through a great awakening. And two of the leaders were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. You may have heard of the Great Awakenings in the 1700s. Jonathan Edwards was the first guy, and he preached. He was a small guy. He was a small of stature. You even see pictures of him. He doesn't look intimidating. You would think these great revivalist preachers, I've had pastors from my youth. Our pastor he would preach loud and bold, and he would walk around, and Jonathan Edwards was not that way. He was very, very stoic in his delivery. He was a very smart, intellectual person. He was, he was the president of Princeton. The last few weeks of his life, he got sick and died right as he took that job. But he was a graduate of Yale. He was super smart, super intellectual. He was a missionary to the natives before going to Princeton. But even before that, he pastored in Massachusetts. His one prayer in some of his biographical information, his prayer that it was stirring to me to hear. He would fast and pray, God, give me New England. Give me this place for the glory of God. Let these people be saved. He was just praying for that area of the world as he pastored in Massachusetts. He preached his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He would write out his sermons. Again, there were no illustrations, there were no screens, there were no bullet points, he would just read it, and from the top to the bottom, and he would read it verbatim. He would stand behind the lectern, and he wouldn't move. And so it would, in our eyes, it would be a very boring sermon, a very boring service. But it shows the power of God is not limited to style. The power of God is not limited to certain people. I think his prayer life and his fasting and his prayers for New England were helping to spark this. Not only that, some of the writings about Jonathan Edwards in this revival, he spoke about it started with the young people, which is an interesting thing. Teenagers in crossroads age, it started with them. He began having them over, and he began preaching to them very blunt sermons about their lifestyle. Don't go live like the world does. Don't go live in immorality. Stop drinking, stop carousing, and go out on the weekends and going out in the evenings and living a filthy life. God has called us to something else, and it sparked with them. So instead of going out, they started reading the Bible themselves. They started having Bible studies, and one of the reasons that the Great Awakening, according to a few, that it sparked was the young people that Jonathan Edwards had an influence on. He preached this sermon, though, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and if you've read it, it's pretty harsh. Those Puritan Congregationalists, they were to the point. And he says, were it not for the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you one moment. Basically, it's God's grace that you're not in hell right now. You're like a loathsome insect hanging by a thread over the fires of hell. And were it not for a gracious God, you'd fall into hell right now. And the sermon, if you read it, you can, obviously many of you have, you can go online and look at it. It looks like a fiery hell and damnation sermon. And he just read it. And he would look up from his paper and then look down and keep reading. The legend and the stories go in the church when he would do this sermon. When he did this sermon, people were so convicted and so moved at their unconverted state. They were holding on to the church pews. One of his illustrations was just like in the Old Testament, the earth could open up at any moment. And if it weren't for God's grace, it would swallow you up. You'd go right to hell right now. And people would grab the pews and scream out during the sermon, for God's grace and God's help. Please, God, save me. I don't want to go to hell. He preached this famous sermon, and revival spread throughout Massachusetts and New England, and that's what he is known for. And he was a missions-minded man as well. After pastoring, again, he went to the natives, but you can look up his information in this sermon as well, and it's powerful. It is strong, and he just finishes the sermon just like Lot ran. You better run and escape. You better run to God before you die and go to hell. People began getting saved. The other name we talked about was George Whitefield. He was from England. He was known, we don't have time, we'll probably next week get into the Methodists with the Wesleyan revival. John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield were all friends. They all kind of started the Methodist movement, this Methodist group, and of course we hear that name still today. They were called that again. It was a pejorative name. It was the method. They preach separation from the world. We shouldn't act like the world. If we're Christians, we should be different. And the methods and how they acted, and the methods and how much they read the Bible, and how they just acted out. The people just said, you have a method about the Christian life. You're Methodists. Whitefield was the opposite of Jonathan Edwards. He was a loud, booming voice. He came over to the U.S. From England, and he was known for preaching in the open air, out in fields. To the poor, to the farmers, it didn't matter. And he preached, and he was the old evangelist revival, leather lung, preach it to the housetops. He would yell and scream. Ben Franklin was around during that time, and Ben Franklin, with his scientific mind, at one instance, he walked one of the crowds just to kind of see how far back he could still hear the voice. This is no PA, no microphone, and Ben Franklin estimated up to 20 to 30,000 people could hear this man. Without a PA. He was a booming voice. In his 20s, he wasn't very old at all when he began preaching, and he lit England on fire. I'd encourage you to read up on George Whitefield a little bit. He lit England on fire, came to America, and he lit America on fire like nobody else had. He possibly preached an estimated 18,000 times in his 34-year ministry. So the story is that he was on one of his trips, and he came back home to England after however many years he was away, and he saw the deadness of England again, and the Wesleys were there, John and Charles Wesley, but there was still that old formality, that coldness in these dead churches, and a lot of unregenerate church members, because again, it was more of a political thing to go to church. And they began shutting their doors to Whitefield. He couldn't preach in churches. He would go to the Anglican church, wanted nothing to do with him. The Church of England said, you're too bombastic, you're too loud. And one of the quotes was, you keep talking about being born again. And we don't want that. And it's amazing to hear that. But he had a decision to make, and he went to the Wesleys, especially John Wesley. John Wesley was a lot more buttoned up, and he didn't want to rock the boat. He wanted to stay and kind of help the church. And Whitefield said, if they don't want me, I'll preach. I don't need your license to preach, and I don't need your building to preach. And he began just going out into the highways and hedges, literally. He would go to fields and farmers. He would go to the poor. He would go to the drunks. And it was a wild time. They would throw things at him. They would scream and curse back at him. But many of them started hearing the message and got saved. One instance, it was told that 40 people showed up. And, by the next time this crowd gathered, it was thousands of people showed up. One farmer, I'm trying to remember his name, Nathan Cole, something like that. I have to go look it up again. One farmer writes about George Whitefield coming This is back in America because he did revivals in both countries. He talked about hearing about this George Whitefield and wanting and longing to hear him preach. So he was farming the field one day, and he said it was 8 or 9 o'clock. And the messenger came to town and said, Whitefield's going to be here at 10 in such and such town. That was within distance. Well, it was a few miles. There's no cars, but by horse. He ran in and grabbed his wife, grabbed his horse, said, get ready, let's go. We have to go hear Whitefield. And they took off. He said, I ran my horse till my horse couldn't go. I got off my horse and made my wife go without me, and I ran as far as I could, chasing my horse with my wife. And he said, for miles and miles and miles, I didn't want to be late. This George Whitefield is coming. By the time they got to the city, he said there was a smoke that had come up. It looked like a river or waterfall, this mist that came up like a rain. I didn't know what it was. And he said, I came up on it. And what it was other horses, other men trying to get in to hear George Whitefield. And they finally got all together. It was this stampede of horses and people. And by the time they got there, he said it was probably 3,000 or 4,000 people estimated showed up to hear George Whitefield. And he said, when I heard that message, I realized my life was not good enough. There was just, without internet, without Facebook, without social media, people thronged to George Whitefield to hear him preach because of the message of you must be born again. People weren't preaching that. And he was preaching it clear and straight, and he was preaching it hard. And the drunks were getting saved. The lower class were getting saved. The farmers were getting saved. Not only that, the religious crowd, back to England, it was said the farmers would kneel beside those dressed in silk and those dressed in the best, and the rich and the poor were meeting together to hear Whitefield. He went back to England, and he told John Wesley, you need to get out here and join me. Let's get after it. And so he began preaching in the fields, and crowds came. And he started in England what is known as the Wesleyan Revival. Started the Great Awakening in America, the Wesleyan Revival in England. He wasn't an organizer. He was just a wild man preacher, I think. He was just a loud, bombastic preacher. The Wesleys were kind of attributed for organizing. You know, he didn't send people to their churches. Once they got converted and saved, he didn't really do anything with them. But it was the Wesleys that took those converted people and organized assemblies and organized places to meet, and really the Methodist movement really took off during the Wesleyan Revival. And it's just an interesting thing that people were unregenerate and ungodly back then, and so cold and so dark toward religious things and toward the things of God. And it's just a reminder that preaching the straight gospel with Holy Spirit power and conviction can change lives. The preaching of the cross is what changes lives, and Whitefield did it a different way than Edwards. But that sparks the Great Awakening in America. We may hit the Wesleys a little bit more next week, but as we turn back to America, if you look at history, America has revival, England has revival, France does not have revival. And if you compare the French Revolution, where political violence was the norm, the guillotine was pulled out in the street, and thousands upon thousands of people would have their head chopped off by the guillotine, and the next ruler would come on and kill all those people. It was a bloody, ugly revolution that changed really world history in France. And people like us would attribute France's revolution versus the American Revolution, in which we, with thought and with purpose, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and on principle we went to war, whereas France went to war because of anarchy and frustration and godlessness. There was an atheism and the French Romanticism had taken over that part of the world in France. And so it was an atheistic, godless revolution. And a lot of writers believe that the founding fathers, they might not have all been born again. Some of them, I believe, were. But they had principle and thought and morality about what they were doing. And they wrote the Declaration. And, of course, in turn, after writing that and winning the war, wrote the Constitution. And some of the great thinkers of our time came through those 55 men that wrote the Constitution. They were some of the most brilliant minds at that time to do a whole new country, a whole new way, and a whole new thing. And all that to say is the revival and the mission spirit that happened in Europe that came over to the United States brought that about. And we are the recipients of that. It's an interesting thing. Even today, we see this political violence that happens, and many of us stand against it. Many folks are standing out against it, even though there's a lot of folks that don't believe in those things. There's still a remnant. There's still a salt in this country, especially because of just the foundations that we have. So Western thought is a Judeo-Christian thought underpinned by the foundations of revivals like the Great Awakening and the Wesleyan Revival. Okay, we'll continue on next week with this era, a very interesting era, a whole lot more missionaries that we could talk about, but we got to get done for a minute of Bible, so we'll continue on from there. Thanks.